Hi folks, and welcome to our unit on genre. This is the moment in the class when we're starting to take a turn away from the elements of film form and pursuing more film theoretical topics. This week we're looking at less specific and more broad ways of categorizing films. In fact, that's what genre is, a way of categorizing films. Okay, so how do we define genre in a more precise way? So I'm going to draw on our textbook to say that a genre is a category or classification of a group of movies in which the individual films share similar subject matter and similar ways of organizing the subject through narrative and stylistic patterns. And I want to isolate those three different components. Subject matter will give us something like I want to call iconography. Style, we'll get style, and narrative will give us something like narrative and theme. I want to say that these three different components are useful to separate when we talk about genre. What do we mean by these three different components of genre? Let's talk about iconography. When I say the iconography of a genre, I'm referring to the things that you immediately see. Those kinds of objects, costumes, types of characters and how they're identified by spectators, all that stuff that populates a genre. So in the Western, for example, the southwestern desert landscape, tough cowboys, lonely sheriffs, dangerous or faithful Indians, guns, horses. That is the stuff that populates the Western. In terms of style, though, right, you'll get long shots of desert landscapes and pans across landscapes, right? You'll get particular ways of moving the camera, particular kinds of mise-en-scène and how it's shot, right? These things are distinguished in a way from the things that populate those particular shots. And third, you'll get narrative and theme. What are the thematic concerns of a Western? Well, you have things like nature versus culture. You have man versus environment, the idea of westward expansion, the idea that a story is set near the frontier confronting uncivilized wilderness. And once you do that with a genre, you can start to see other kinds of films that, say, might lack all of the iconography of a genre and still identify the ways in which they could be associated with a genre, such as Star Wars. Star Wars is something that we might call a science fiction, a space opera if you have a broader knowledge of science fiction. But a lot of critics have rightly identified it as partly a Western because it contains a lot of these thematic motifs that we might associate with the Western, despite not looking like a Western, right? That's why it's important to distinguish these three categories. So let's test this out with a film we've already seen. What genre is the film Gravity? Why don't we just break it down in terms of iconography, narrative, and theme, and style? And by the way, when I go through my analysis of this, it's just merely one attempt. There is no answer to the question, what genre is Gravity? It's a generative question with an open-ended set of responses that all would necessitate some kind of claim and argument. So let's think about Gravity as a kind of hybrid genre, right? So we can say that, I think comfortably, that Gravity borrows the iconography of science fiction. Why? Because what you have is a space film. You have the iconography of a space film, including spacesuits and spaceships. And we tend to associate that with science fiction. Maybe we're wrong to do that, but there are reasons that we associate space travel with science fiction because those two things are linked in the history of science fiction. What about theme and narrative? In a way, I want to say that Gravity has little to do with science fiction in the kind of story it tells and the themes that it uses. If anything, I want to say that the narrative pattern of Gravity more closely resembles what you might call a survival movie. You might call it a survival horror film if you want to get specific, but a film like 127 Hours is very similar to Gravity in the kind of story it tells, a story of one person trying to survive against the natural environment, which is extremely harsh. Just to elaborate on this idea of hybrid genres, there's another famous film that I think is maybe the most famous hybrid genre film of all time, perhaps, and that film is Ridley Scott's Alien, which notably takes the iconography of sci-fi. It is set in space, and it has space aliens. But the narrative and style of the film largely draws on slasher horror, an emerging genre at the time. What makes a slasher horror film a slasher horror film? Well, you have a monster that picks off individual people one by one until you have a final person who needs to try to fight the monster. And that's exactly the way that Alien plays. And interestingly enough, if you've watched the sequels to Alien, Aliens plural, or Alien 3, or so on and so forth, most of them are of different genres, right? They're all of the Alien universe, they all have the iconography of sci-fi, but they interestingly operate in totally different ways because they are different attempts to merge the iconography of sci-fi with different genres. So just to have a little bit of fun with this, if anyone in this class has seen the very little seen, but a marginally interesting film, Life, from 2017. It happens to be a hybrid of hybrids, if you've seen it. It very much is trying to put together Alien with Gravity. And if you've seen the film, I hope, if you've seen all these three films, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. But to give you some visual evidence, you can see, for instance, that it'll take things like Alien's monster horror and Gravity's spacewalk anxiety, this like first-person view of feeling anxious when you're floating freely in space, and it'll take those two elements and juxtapose them throughout the film, a hybrid of two hybrids, just to show you how flexible genres are. And that's kind of the point that I want to make. Genres are extremely flexible, and that doesn't mean that you can't argue with your friends about what, say, film X falls into genre category Y. It's very much a fun conversation to have, but you should keep in mind that these are generative conversations without necessarily true answers. So I do want to say that genres are flexible, but so are many kinds of categories. I think there's a larger lesson that we can take from this, just to think about what categories are in general. So just to give you a kind of philosophical example, what is a chair? Well, a chair, if we want to define it, is a seat for one person, typically with a back and four legs. That seems like a fine and dandy definition of a chair. And that's the picture of the chair from our official dictionary definition. But these things are also chairs, are they not? They don't have any of the criteria that I earlier ascribed to the golden chair in the sky, but functionally we will describe these things as chairs. And so I want to say that genres, like many categories, don't come from the sky. That is, they are not given by some preordained authority on all matters of what thing falls into what category. Rather, the genres themselves emerge from the examples that exist in the world. It's not usually how we think about categories and the constituents of a category, but generally, semantically, this is how it works. Think about all these different chairs. And you can think productively about the relationship between, say, this ideal chair and other chairs that are less ideal in terms of core and periphery. You might have a group of objects that lies at the center for intuiting what, say, a concept of chair is, and then you have things that are farther away from the center. And we can think about genres in a similar way. So Gravity exists, one might say, on the periphery of science fiction and survival cinema, and perhaps even horror. It doesn't really seem to exemplify science fiction in the way that a film like 2001: A Space Odyssey came to exemplify science fiction. But imagine if enough films are inspired by Gravity in the years to come, and perhaps it will be the center of its own spacewalk terror genre, right? You can imagine, especially if films like Life become very popular, that a new genre might emerge after a number of examples exist that demand this new genre to be named, right? That's kind of the flexibility and historical contingency of genres, right? They're always propping up and then dissipating and changing with the history of film. And this is how most categories work. Now I want to talk about the functions of genre. So why do we have genres? What functions do they serve? Well, I want to say that they serve four different groups of people. The first group of people is film marketers, right? Why would they want to have genres? Well, they can connect a film to the most receptive audience, maximizing profits. It provides a rough view of successful trends to chase. What about audiences? Why would you, as an audience member, a spectator, want genres in your life? Well, it provides ways to structure your expectations. It allows for easy spotting of movies that you would enjoy. Think about how useful it is for you as a user of, say, Netflix to organize your own tastes by genre. It also provides, or it combines, the pleasures of familiarity with the pleasures of clever twists on formula. Any of you who are fans of horror will know that certain horror films, say very meta or reflexive horror films, are really pleasurable by virtue of the fact that you know horror films, right? There is a kind of pleasure there that hinges on your familiarity with a genre, and you are rewarded for being familiar with that genre. What about filmmakers? Some people might think that if you're a true artist, you might hate genres because it puts a boundary around your creativity. But think about it differently, right? Formulas kind of aid in the screenwriting process. It's very hard to write from scratch, but if you're writing with a particular set of forms, it's a lot easier to do. A set of restrictions aids in the creative process. And it also ends with simplified casting decisions. And what about critics? What use might genre have for critics? Genres provide a vocabulary by which broad swaths of films can be compared to one another and comparatively assessed, right? You might think that this film X is ridiculous, but your friend might say, no, this is actually an example of Y genre. And then you might see it anew. Genres also provide an opportunity to comment on emerging trends, sense patterns, and maybe coin new terms that make their way into the general parlance. So we're going to get into that a little bit later and just discover how useful as a critical aid genre is. So I want you to think about these four bodies of people as operating in a kind of network, right? They're all mutually influencing each other, and the very phenomenon we call genre emerges from that interaction. So getting away from that, we've discussed what is a genre, right, as a kind of category and why it's flexible. What are its functions? What does it do for four main groups of people that create genre? But the main thing I want us to think about is, what does genre analysis look like? After all, the aim of this course is to do film analysis, and I want genre to become a tool for our analysis of film. Well, we can think about it this way, that genres create formal patterns, right? We talked about form in this class, but there are forms that are particular to genres. We've talked in a way about recent action films that are associated with their editing, hyperkinetic editing practices like we saw in the film Mad Max Fury Road. Or think about slasher horror films, which we'll talk about more in this unit, which use off-screen space to generate fear of what lies around the frame. Westerns, as I mentioned earlier, are notable for their predilection for panning over desert vistas. And rom-coms often will give us non-diegetic score that swells when love is professed.
Yes, is being my answer. Easy question.
All of these patterns generally reflect social values. And this is a kind of new direction in our course that I want us to think about. We've talked about the level of social and political meaning in our films, but genre is a really useful way to talk about social and political meanings in our films because genres tend to be popular. And things that are popular often will reflect the values of a society. I want us to look at a couple parodies from Saturday Night Live that make us aware of the social values reflected in particular genre forms.
Cool guys don't look at explosions. They blow things up and then walk away. Who's got time to watch an explosion? The more you ignore it, the cooler you look.
So the more you ignore it, the cooler you look. At this point in 2020, the cool guys don't look at explosions trope from action cinema has kind of fallen to the wayside. And partly because of parodies like this that started to pick them out and point out the ridiculousness of them to us. But if we see the litany of examples demonstrated here, we'll start to realize that there is a kind of structure of masculinity. We can clearly see that there's something about either creating violence or danger, or say withstanding violence or danger, but not being kind of absorbed into the spectacle of it, to be so cool and aloof that you can walk away from an explosion. That seems to kind of define a certain brand of American masculinity in the action film. And one could continue to do analysis of this, but I just wanted to draw your attention to something kind of superficial or apparently superficial that can contain ideological meaning. So building off this idea that genres can create formal patterns and that those formal patterns can reflect social values, we can also think about other genres as manifesting patterns based on character archetypes and narrative archetypes. And a lot of genre-based analysis does this kind of thing. Just to give you a glimpse of one of these forms of analysis that you're likely familiar with, think of this notion of the manic pixie dream girl that was popularized about a decade ago as a character archetype that was observed in certain kind of male-led indie romantic comedy films.
A manic pixie dream girl.
See, I have a gift. Special ability to help men with problems.
Originally coined by AV Club writer Nathan Rabin, this term became part of the pop culture vernacular because it so perfectly encapsulated a certain type of female character that had become prevalent in a certain type of movie. Men who need a manic pixie dream girl are typically lonely, depressed, tortured, or driven by their careers.
I'm not saying I don't cry, but in between, I laugh and I realize how silly it is to take anything too seriously.
The once timid or dejected male protagonist emerges from his encounter with a manic pixie dream girl ready to embrace life's challenges and idiosyncrasies.
And the critic who coins this term calls it that bubbly, shallow cinematic creature that exists solely in the fevered imaginations of sensitive writer-directors to teach broodingly soulful young men to embrace life and its infinite mysteries and adventures. So I hope it's clear that the idea of the manic pixie dream girl, as it's been named, is a social critique based on a gender hierarchy in which dominantly male writer-directors unwittingly have created a kind of female character that lacks autonomy and agency in order to fulfill their kind of gender-imbalanced wish for what they think an ideal relationship is like. So that's the kind of social and political value that genre analysis can do. And we're going to return to this when we look at horror in our next video lesson. Okay, thanks.